Welcome to the seminar on the Gospel of Mary and Magdalenic Gnosis. This is the first module, and in order to understand the background to Mary Magdalene, we're going to look at the women disciples of Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus. I want to give you an outline of our study. There are 3 modules. In the first, we're considering the women disciples of Mar Yeshua, but they were not just disciples. Many became what we call apostles. We're going to look at the status of the women among the disciples and apostles that, according to legend, were the 12 apostles of Jesus and the 77 some odd disciples of Jesus and so on. We're going to look at what the status of women was and how they functioned. We're going to look at Mary Magdalene as the foremost of them, because she is presented even in the later literature that marginalizes women as the foremost of the women disciples of Yeshua. And we're going to look at the vital role of women leaders in the first churches. And one of the main sources for that information is going to be St. Paul, who has kind of a bad rap about his attitude towards women, but we will now find is one of our best sources for information about the earliest women apostles and disciples. We're going to look at the marginalization of Mary Magdalene and the authority of women in the early churches that begins to be strongly established about the time of the writing of the first Greek Gentile New Testament literature, which we call the Gospels and the Epistles, from about AD 70 to 120. And then we're going to look at the exclusion of women's authority that occurs in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and the defamation of the character of Mary Magdalene in the churches in this period. In the second module, we're going to go on a quest for the historical Miriam of Magdala, Mary of Magdala. We're going to take a look at her legends, the legends that grew up about her, the repentant prostitute, and the great saint who repented for many years in a cave in France, and all these things. And then we're going to look at her probable history, her true life. And then in the third module, we're going to examine the Gospel of Mary, which seems to be a true and historical remnant of her apostolic tradition. And we're going to try to recover the authentic Magdalenic tradition that was suppressed in the earliest churches. We're going to recover her historic apostolic gnosis, which in Aramaic would be manda, from Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus. And it is clear that she was initiated more than any of the other disciples or apostles into the mysteries of the Malkuth, which is the sovereignty or the mystic presence of God and heaven. And we're going to look carefully at her ascent, the ascent of her soul through the 4 olamim, or the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, and the 7 makomim, and the 7 places. And we're going to talk a little about the significance of women's apostolic gnosis in the 21st century for a not just a renewal, but for a revision of Christianity, long needed. Now, the other thing we want to do is to make it clear that there's a lot of popular Mary Magdalene literature that is not based in valid, peer-reviewed scholarship. It's just out there to make money or to push certain kinds of mythic and legendary ideas, which are very popular and people are very receptive to, because Christianity is tremendously patriarchal. But if you want to learn the truth about Mary Magdalene and her tradition, you will want to avoid the following fictions: the Da Vinci Code, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and other books that are based on the Merovingian Grail legends from Europe. Now, the Merovingians, who came into power about the 5th century in Gaul, claimed descent from Jesus himself when they wore long hair and claimed a bloodline from Jesus, and that kept them in power because other tribes and other groups were afraid to attack them because of their mystic, totemistic power. And this was created to bolster their dynastic authority and keep them going. And in fact, it kept them going until the 9th century when the Carolingians, when Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was able to defeat them in battle, and he came up with his own version of holy blood, Holy Grail things, which basically were the Eucharist and some other strange things like a relic of the supposed foreskin of the baby Jesus and so on. There's other literature that claims that Mary Magdalene was married to or conceived a child with Jesus. This is simply not true. It's part of old legends that were made for political reasons to establish a certain political dynasty in Europe. You will learn in these studies that Mary Magdalene was old enough to be the mother of Yeshua. In fact, she was about the age of Yeshua's mother, and she died about the time Yeshua's mother, Miriam, would have died. You want to also avoid authors like Margaret Starbird, who wrote The Woman with the Alabaster Jar and things like this, or Jean Marcalli, who writes about the supposed treasure of René Le Chateau, and those type of books that talk about great and intriguing subjects like the Templar treasures and so on, and books making claims about the Priory of Sion, which existed but was not anything that had to do with a bloodline or bloodline descendants of Jesus. This was a fiction that was implanted into mid-20th century archives by a French Vichy Nazi occultist, and it was used to mislead the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And if you want to learn about it, find the last issue of Gnosis magazine. They have a long article devoted to this guy and how he planted all these legends into archives in Europe to fool the people that made Holy Blood, Holy Grail, because he himself was trying to claim descent from this bloodline and build a political empire based on that. So, unfortunately, people who write books like this that I'm telling you to avoid don't have the skills to differentiate fact from legend. They simply don't know enough about the topic, and they don't know enough about the Western mystery tradition to understand what's going on with all this. You also want to avoid Catholic or other literature that maintains the fiction that Mary Magdalene was a fallen woman or a repentant prostitute or anything of this sort. This is still a big deal in Catholicism, and it's simply wrong. It's not true. That was a 4th to 5th century spin that was the final shot at marginalizing Mary Magdalene and women leadership in the church. But what you do want to do is you want to seek out books by scholars like Karen King, whom I'm going to recommend here as for if you just get one book, get her book. It's probably the best. And scholars like Anne Brock and Jacob Needleman, Margaret George, Marvin Meyer. If you search on Amazon or any of the online bookstores for books about Mary Magdalene, these are the authors whose books you want to buy. Don't buy the others because they are completely not in touch with reality or with truth. So if you want to get one book on the Gospel of Mary and the traditions of Mary of Magdala, then get this book, The Gospel of Mary of Magdala by Karen King. She's a very good scholar. She's written and done a lot of original research that is influencing a lot of people because she's basically bringing to light the information that we need to have now about Mary and about that whole apostolic tradition that was suppressed. You'll notice that on the front of her book she uses a classic painting, Actually, it's an Eastern Orthodox painting, I believe, or Russian Orthodox, uh, of Mary Magdalene holding an egg. The egg is part of an ancient legend that is told when Mary, the apostle, went to Rome and preached to the emperor, according to legend. She had an egg, hard-boiled egg, I suppose, and the egg magically and miraculously went from white to a whole lot of beautiful colors, and therefore showing the emperor that what she spoke was the truth, and so on. And this legend of Mary is the legend that supports the tradition at Easter time in the Russian and Eastern Orthodox churches of the painting of eggs and the Easter egg, which does not come, by the way, from the Nordic goddess Esther, as a lot of the medieval fundamentalists thought when they condemned the Easter legends. But it's a very early legend, the legend of Mary Magdalene and the Easter egg. Now, Yeshua, Jesus, the Master Jesus, Yeshua, Mar Yeshua, had many contacts with women. We are all familiar with these, and I'm going to just kind of review them, because rabbis of his time did not. Rabbis associated only with men. They ate with men. They spoke with men. They studied with men. They argued with men. They did not accept women disciples. That was just not done in Israel. But Yeshua was a complete wildcat. He was a wild card. He accepted women as disciples. He ate with women. He associated with women. He interacted with women. For example, the Samaritan woman that Yeshua is said to have met at a well. Now, Samaria is an interesting situation. We hear of the stories of the Good Samaritan, who is better than the Judean righteous people who don't stop and help the man who's been beaten by thieves on the road, but the Samaritan does. What is this about the Samaritans? Well, the Samaritans were the people who were not of royal lineage, who were not taken in captivity to Babylon in the 5th century BC, when all the princes and the royalty and the educated people in Israel were taken to Babylon for captivity, and the land was abandoned to the Amma Haaretz, the people of the land. And these people of the land intermarried with women who were both Jewish and non-Jewish. They were Canaanite women and so on. Well, later on, a century or two later, when Ezra and Nehemiah returned with a legation of people to come and rebuild the temple, having earned that favor from the rulers of what was then the Persian Empire, they found all these native people living in Palestine and Israel, and they were all intermarried. Jewish men had intermarried with non-Jewish women, that is, Canaanite women and so on. And they told these people, you have to get a divorce. Divorce these women and marry our good Jewish women that have come with us, or else we're going to kick you out of Israel. You're not going to be part of Israel. And the people who chose not to divorce their wives and kick them out and remarry Israeli women were the ones who were excluded from Israel, and they occupied the territory sort of north and west of Judea, between Judea and Galilee, and up into Galilee, and they were called the Samaritans, or the Sumerians. And they were considered to be second-class citizens. They, in fact, had their own high priest, they had their own temple, they had their own way of life. In fact, the Samaritans, or the Sumerians, maintained their form of Judaism down to the late 20th century, at which time there were only about 500 of them left, and their hereditary leader was a moron. He was mentally retarded, but they maintained some of the oldest and best kept copies of the Old Testament, and they are used by scholars to look at the earliest versions of many of the writings of the Old Testament. Well, these Samaritans and these Samaritans were considered to be second-class citizens. Jesus, in his parables, extolled them as being more righteous than the self-righteous people of Judea. For example, as we say, the story of the Good Samaritan. Well, here we have a story of Yeshua meeting a woman who is a Samaritan woman. And when he meets her at the well, he is able to tell her many things about herself psychically, because he was a very powerful psychic. Told her how many husbands she had had and all this kind of sort of thing. And he took time with her, spent time with her, and taught her something. He spent time with somebody who was considered to be a reject, not a real Jew, not a real person. One of the great things that the prophets of Israel did, and that is attributed, for example, to Elijah, is the raising of a dead son of a widow. Because you see, after a woman's husband died, she had only her sons, or maybe one son, to support her. Without that, she had no means of support. And so one of the great things that the prophet could do, did, and was attributed to the prophet Elijah, was the raising of the only son of a widow who had died. The son had died, and the widow was in mourning and grieving in terrible straits, and the prophet raised her son up so he could then take care of her. There is a story in the New Testament about Yeshua. It's the same thing, that a widow's only son has died, and he raises him from the dead. And that is a story about Yeshua interacting with and having mercy upon and pity for. There is a story of another woman who's a widow. She has no one to take care of her. And Yeshua is with his disciples, according to this legend. And she comes up to the temple in Jerusalem, or the synagogue, and she gives a donation of what she has to give. Now, people donated money to the synagogue because the synagogue took care of the sick and the weak. It also provided public education. The first system of public education came through the Jewish synagogues, and public welfare. And so it was considered to be a mitzvah, to a good work, to donate money to the charities. Well, here's this woman who comes up. She's a widow, and she's donating. And what does she have? She has what would be the equivalent in our culture of 1 copper penny. She has the smallest denomination of the smallest amount of money. Some of the some of the disciples look at her and think she's a little stingy because she's donating this very small amount. And Yeshua says, no, that is all the money that woman has, because he knows this psychically. She has given her last bit of money and made this donation. Therefore, her gift and her donation is greater than anyone else in this city. And then the story of the woman with a hemorrhage. Now, I don't know what it was, but she couldn't stop bleeding, whether she had real severe fibroids or whatever it was. This is a very dangerous condition. Yeshua evoked healing from people through laying on of hands and through other means. And he always told them when they were healed, you have healed yourself. It is your fidelity, your faithfulness that has healed you. And it's translated very badly in the King James Version of the Bible as your faith has made you whole. Your faith has healed you. This, as we will learn in other seminars about the teachings of Yeshua, this is not true. Today we think of faith as belief. And it is not true that Jesus was telling people that, well, your belief has made you whole. If you just believe enough, it'll do this for you and do that. If that were the case, we have so many people believing so many false things in the world today, both political and religious and everything else. We would have a terrible set of miracles going on if belief were all it took to change things. But no, faith is amen, fidelity, faithfulness. And because she had within herself faithfulness, and that spiritual faithfulness in her soul, And when she touched Yeshua, Yeshua felt virtue, as it says in the old translations, meaning power going out of him, meaning vital force, vital energy coming out of his body and going to her, because he healed by means of the use of vital force and vital energy, and his vital force stimulated the vital force in the woman, and her bleeding stopped, and she considered herself to be healed. And so he says his disciples want to push her away because she's trying to touch him and he's tired and all this sort of thing. And he says to her, your fidelity, your faithfulness has made you whole. And one of our favorite images, the repentant prostitute. In fact, this is the bad rap that was given to Mary Magdalene. Yeshua is sitting at a banquet, a big meal, and a woman who is known to be a harlot, or a woman who is supporting herself through prostitution, that is, a woman without a man, a woman whose husband has died, or who has been divorced, or whose husband has divorced her, put her away, and has no one to support her, and had to fall upon doing what any woman would have to do to support herself in that society. A prostitute, repentant of her life and misdeeds, comes on her knees to Yeshua and washes his feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. And the Pharisee who is hosting the meal says, what kind of prophet can this man be? Does he not know the manner of woman that's touching him? This woman is unclean. She is not the kind of person that you would want to even be near. Any rabbi would be anywhere near. And Yeshua says, I'll tell you truly, amen, amen, I'm going to tell you the truth, that this woman's repentance and her tears are more pleasing to God than anything you've ever done in your life. Something like that, okay? So this is another contact with women, and so much of these contacts with women show an understanding of women, an understanding that a man who was an ascetic, a man who had never had a wife, a man who had never loved a woman, a man who had not had those kinds of experiences, simply would not have the capability of expressing. We're told that when Yeshua is at a wedding in Cana and they run out of wine, he transforms the water into wine for the people in order to save the event for the hostess. And then we have a very famous story about the woman taken in adultery. This woman is caught doing the nasty, or having finished doing the nasty, or whatever it is, and she's married to someone else. Well, the punishment for that by Old Testament law is to be stoned to death, and that is at the option of the husband. Now, according to the story, the woman is brought to Yeshua because he's a rabbi, he's a Rav, a saint, a great one who gives rulings on the Torah and on the rules of Jewish life. And they say, here's a woman we caught in adultery, what should we do with her? And obviously, in the story, they're bringing him to Yeshua because he knows he's a woman sympathizer. What is he going to say about this? And possibly to catch him and show that his teachings are not proper and all this sort of thing. Well, first of all, we have to understand this story of the woman taken in adultery does not appear in the earliest gospel texts. The earliest gospel stories are written in Mark, and then later in the other synoptics, Matthew and Luke, and then the stories much later in the Johannine literature. In the earliest versions of their texts, we do not have this story of the woman taken in adultery. It apparently comes into the Gospels about AD 120 or 130 when it starts to appear in the texts. And these manuscripts are written and rewritten. They're copied by copyists, and things are added to them. We know that this is very true, especially of Luke's Gospel and the book of the Acts, but of all the Gospels, material gets added to them. They grow, they get bigger and fatter, they tell more stories. And it's amazing that as you get farther and farther away from historical events, suddenly more and more and more is being told about them, and that gives you some idea of what the historical veracity of these later versions are. But The legends may be, in fact, a legend that came down through a reliable source, somebody whose grandfather told it to him because his grandfather was a disciple of a disciple of a disciple, or something like that. But it's a great story because it gets across the whole idea of the relationship and the sympathy that Yeshua had for women and all downtrodden classes, because women were part of those classes. And the woman is taken in adultery, according to the story. He's asked what should be done with her, and he draws in the sand, and then he says, let whoever among you is without sin cast the first stone. And one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, they each turned around, dropped their stones, and left. And then he says to the woman, and I myself also do not condemn you, but go your way, but do not sin anymore. So it's a great story, and it's a story of Yeshua and women, and the whole life of Yeshua is full of these stories of Yeshua. There is the story of the raising of the daughter of Jairus, who has died, and he raises her, Talitha Kumi, stand up, little girl, and she comes out of a coma, and he says she's not dead, she's just sleeping, and so on. And so there are many stories like this of Yeshua and women. And Yeshua had women disciples, many, many disciples, and these were not just disciples, even though they are just referred to as disciples in the New Testament literature, which is 2 generations later and which has already started to marginalize women. They were, in fact, apostles, many of them. Many of them were great preachers, just like Peter and so on. And we always find Yeshua in the context of women wherever we go and wherever we look in the gospel stories. And the reality of his relationship with women is something that could not be marginalized even in the Greek Gentile world of the domination of women by men that early Christianity grew up in. And so even when those Gospels are written and that spin is starting to develop, they can't take away these facts because they're too much part and parcel of the story of the life of Yeshua. Now the Gospels then, which are writings from the period, what I call the period of marginalization of women, AD 70 to 90. These are the Gospel of Luke and Matthew and John's Gospel and so on, and Mark has already begun the process a little earlier. Writings from us tell us about who the women disciples of Yeshua were. We're going to find out later that these women were not just disciples, they were apostles. From Galilee, we're told about the Miriams. There's lots of Miriams, lots of Marys. Miriam is translated as Mary. And one of the strange things is there are so many Marys, and it's probably because there are so many different Marys that in legend later on, as women are marginalized, they became almost subsumed under the category of Miriams, because the greatest of them was Miriam of Magdala, Mary of Magdala. But the Miriams included Mary Magdalene, Miriam of Magdala, and we would call these people by their names, Miriam. Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph and Salome. Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and Joseph and James, who was the brother of Jesus. Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and then Salome, who is the mother of John and James the elder, and will become John the Apostle. And Joanna, who is the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's household manager, and Herod was a bitter enemy of Yeshua, and his wife, the man Chuza, who managed the household of Herod in the very same place where Yeshua once worked as a mason, as a stonemason, was a disciple of Yeshua. And there are many other women that we find at the time of the crucifixion. Mark tells us that many other women who came up with him unto Jerusalem. These are women from Galilee, and Galilee is his real home base and the place where most of the women were. From Judea, which was part of his later ministry, because he spent most of his journeys and his teaching and preaching in Galilee and around the Sea of Galilee, and finally he makes forays and excursions into Judea toward Jerusalem. And from Judea we have some of his best-known women disciples. Mary of Bethany. She is the woman with the alabaster jar, the prophetess. And her sister Martha of Bethany. Mary and Martha. Susanna. And probable others would be the repentant prostitute who washed his feet with her hair. However, in John's Gospel, Mary of Bethany is identified as the, and wrongly so probably, as the prostitute, the repentant prostitute who washes the feet of Jesus with her hair. Now remember, John's Gospel was written early in the 2nd century. It's very late and very much separated from an awful lot of these things, and there are more mistakes there because later on, when Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene is going to be the one who's supposed to be the repentant prostitute who washes Jesus' feet with her hair, and that's going to be declared by a pope in about the 4th or 5th century. And then there is the woman with the hemorrhage who probably became a disciple, the widow whose son was raised from the dead, and many others. These would be from the area of Judea. Now there was an inner circle of women disciples. Now my criteria for what I call the inner circle of women would be these. First, they would be present in the gospel accounts both in Galilee and Judea. That means they traveled with Yeshua, or they at times traveled with him. They weren't just in one place hosting him, but they actually were with him in both places. And they provided support and hospitality for him in their homes or through other ways of contributions of money so they could buy food and so on. And they were present at the crucifixion. If we find the names of women that meet these criteria, all these 3 criteria, these are women that I would classify as part of the inner circle of women around Yeshua. And the members of this group are Miriam of Magdala, who is also known as the beloved, the most beloved disciple of Yeshua in much of the early Christian literature. Miriam of Bethany, who was a prophetess. That would be Mary of Bethany. Miriam, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph and Salome. And Joanna, who is the mother of the Apostle John of John's Gospel, and James the Elder. These were the sons of Zebedee. John was a very, very young boy, and James was his older brother who really took care of him. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who was the steward of Herod, appears with Yeshua as far south as in Judea. Possibly Miriam, the mother of Jesus. The mother of Jesus is not ever mentioned as among the disciples of Yeshua. In fact, the only mention of her in Mark's Gospel, which is very early, is she's standing outside of a place where Yeshua is teaching, hosted by Peter and his mother and that family, and she and a couple of her children are standing outside and calling, and people say your mother and your brothers are calling to you. They're afraid that you're crazy. They think you're nuts. They think you've been possessed by a demon. Come on out. Well, probably she thinks he's crazy to be going around and preaching in an area so close to where Herod was, or something like that. But in any case, she's clearly not being a disciple of Yeshua. She's still being mama, and she's concerned about what's going on. But by the time that he finally finishes his ministry and he's crucified, etc., she appears there. She is at the side at the cross, and so on. Now, of all these, only Mary Magdalene Mary Magdalene leaves us a true apostolic tradition. We're going to discuss what an apostolic tradition is later. And that comes through the fragmentary and suppressed Gospel of Miriam, the Gospel of Mary, which no scholar doubts is any Mary but Mary of Magdala. There is a Magdalenic gnosis, a special internal inner circle knowledge in this document based on apostolic initiation, which was done one-to-one, and teaching that was transmitted privately by Yeshua, by Jesus. And we have traditions of Jesus teaching James, John, and Peter in a group of 3 and taking him up on a mountain for visions that they did not understand. But we have in this gospel a one-to-one kind of initiation that Yeshua gives into the mysteries of the Malkuth, or the so-called kingdom of heaven. We have one other place, the secret Gospel of Mark, that tells us a story of Yeshua initiating a man, one man, a single man, into that very same thing. This is the young man, or Neanos, of Mark's secret gospel, which we will discuss later when we discuss the Gospel of Mary and try to understand what it's all about. And this tradition that she received was unlike that received by the traditional male apostles. It was a higher, more spiritual, and more advanced kind of teaching that she received than the others. Why? Because she could receive it. She was capable of it. Anyone who's ever worked with gurus knows that a guru gives to his chelas what each one needs and what each one can handle and what each one can do. It's not a cookie-cutter thing. And Mary of Magdala received probably the very highest teaching that Yeshua was able to transmit to a human being. The male apostles were taught in groups at table meals, messianic banquets, table meals. The transfiguration experience of James, Peter, and John was done in a group of 3. But we know from initiatic traditions of this period that it is only when you get to the group of 1, the one-to-one initiation, that you have reached the highest or the pinnacle of the initiatic scheme, as you have in the Hermetic tradition, for example. And that is something that Mary Magdalene received. And it's no wonder that she was called the disciple whom Jesus loved, or people ask, why do you love her more than you love us, and so on. So we have stories about Mary and Martha of Bethany, Miriam and Martha. They were patrons of Yeshua. They supported him, they fed him, they gave him housing, and they were probably wealthy. They lived in the small village of Bethany to the south and east of Jerusalem. And in the later ministry of Yeshua, which was in Judea, his original ministry was in Galilee, and he spent most of his time there. In the later part of his ministry, they figure quite prominently. They are sisters. And in John's Gospel and in later legends, they have a brother named Lazarus. And in John's Gospel, Yeshua raises Lazarus from the dead. The story of the raising of people from the dead, and especially the raising of Lazarus in the Johannine tradition, is not a miracle as you would find in the Markan tradition or the Petrine tradition. It is what we call a semeion. It is part of the gospel of the signs, and the prophets performed more than just mere miracles. They performed signs or allegories that had a great deal of meaning, and the raising of Lazarus is one of these things, and it seems to be very much associated with the deep mysteries that Yeshua would have imparted to Mary of Magdala. And John's Gospel seems to be part of that apostolic tradition that was received by Mary Magdalene as it's later interpreted and becomes a teaching about Jesus, unfortunately, rather than the teachings of Yeshua. But Lazarus is supposed to be the brother of these two sisters in later tradition, that is the Johannine tradition, which we think is a an outgrowth of Magdalenic Gnosis. Now, women disciples were much more capable of psychic and certain kinds of activities that are subjective, that men do not do so well. We are told that a woman comes at Bethany with burial spices, not too long before Yeshua is going to be arrested and crucified. And it's just before the final Passover journey to Jerusalem. And she is referred to as a woman with an alabaster jar. Alabaster jar used to hold precious spices and ointments, especially those used for burial. Now, she's anonymous in the Synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in the Gospel of John, she's identified as Mary of Bethany. So Mary of Bethany gets to do two things. She gets to be a prophet, and she gets to be a prostitute. So it's all kind of confusing. But according to this story, Mary of Bethany comes to Yeshua when he is sitting at meal and teaching people, and she anoints him with burial spices. And it's nothing that she says. She simply does this act. This is a prophetic act. She foresees the coming death and crucifixion of Yeshua. So she's the sister of Lazarus, whom Yeshua raised from the dead in John's Gospel. And she prophesies the death of Yeshua in this way, and Yeshua knows that it's true. It's very important to understand that in the early church, as we learn mostly from Paul, not from any other Christian literature, that women were prophetesses. They were capable of making the kind of connections with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of Holiness, the Holy Spirit, that enabled them to give psychic and prophetic and channeled advice to people. Mary Magdalene, she is known as the first witness of the resurrection in traditional Christianity, because it is she that goes to the tomb and finds it empty. And then So what was an apostle, and what did it mean to be an apostle? Well, it meant to be a disciple of Yeshua's inner circle. Yeshua taught to many people publicly, but his inner circle met with him and they ate with him. And it's at the meals that he taught them, and at their private gatherings that he taught them more plainly about the mysteries of what is translated very badly as the kingdom. Literally, the mysteries of the Malkuth. Now, as we've said before, the fact that he had both male and female disciples was a radical break with rabbinic tradition. No one else did this. The disciples, the inner circle of disciples, were taught privately in small groups and sometimes even one-to-one. The Gospels tell only of Yeshua teaching in as small a group as 3. But the secret Gospel of Mark tells about him teaching one individual person. And the Magdalenic tradition speaks also of being taught one-to-one. So a disciple of Yeshua's inner circle would have received the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, for healing and exorcism. That means that apostles had apostolic powers. And they were powers of healing, and they were powers of banishing evil spirits. The term apostle originally was applied to one who had been a full-time disciple traveling and eating with Yeshua. Not just a place where Yeshua would come and stop on one of his journeys, but who traveled in the entourage of Yeshua. Paul, as we said, claimed that title on the basis of his personal vision, even though he'd never been a disciple of Yeshua. And other mystics, as we said, claimed the title on the basis of their personal visions later on. Now, an apostle had an imperative to transmit the master's teaching and halakha. And the halakha, which literally means walk, the walk of the master, was his way of living, his way of life, the way of spirituality and spiritual life that he taught. Now, in Jewish tradition, the Rav, or Rab, a great one, Rabbi or Rabbi means my great one, the Rav trained and authorized and ordained male successors or a successor to carry on his school of teaching, which was very often known as his gate, his gateway into the Pardes, into the garden, into paradise. Yeshua taught a great deal about discipleship. He taught a great deal about the preparation of the soul for the Messianic age and the Messianic kingdom. And much of his teaching was about the perfection of the human soul. Much more about the details of this can be found in Yeshua the Unknown Jesus, which is a long seminar that we present here. But basically, it was his imperative was to spread that teaching to people, to prepare people for the coming of the new humanity, the new age, the new presence of God, the new sovereignty of God. And that was called the Malkuth of God, or the Malkuth of heaven, which is very badly translated as kingdom, because Malkuth does not mean king domain. It doesn't mean a place that's ruled by a king. It means a sovereignty or a sovereign state. And Yeshua would say, for example, that the Malkuth of God, or the kingdom of heaven, quote unquote, is spread out upon the earth and people do not see it. So it's a mystic concept, but it is also one that is emerging in humanity and in the world. And so the imperative that was given to the apostle was to spread that teaching to other people. The male disciples were sent as prophets to preach the divine message, which was known as the Basor, and they were probably known as Mebazrim in Aramaic, the bringers of the divine message or the divine announcement. It's a term that was applied actually to as a announcement of the birth of a king or some other important matter of a kingdom. And they were sent to heal and exorcise people, which is evidence of the coming in of the divine Malkuth, the divine age, which now that 5,000 years have passed since the beginning of the world, the creation of the world, according to the biblical chronology, this is the time then that the new age would come in, the age of divine sovereignty, where evil will be overthrown in humanity and human beings will become saints. Now, male disciples were sent out to do this. They were told to go to a town or a city and go to one place, to one house, and stay in that house. And then people who wanted to hear the message would come to them. They were not to go door to door. They were not to be evangelists. They were not to go door to door and spread the message. But they were to stay in that town, and people would come and see them. And there they might perform signs of the kingdom, such as exorcism and healing and so on. But the female disciples were different. They served very often as prophetesses. They were heads of home synagogues, home church, home temples. They were channels of spirit guidance, and they were spiritual teachers themselves. They did not go around wandering, spreading the message in such a way as the men did, because women were not supposed to be out traveling alone. If they traveled alone, they could be attacked, they could be raped, and they could be made into servants or slaves. So it was unsafe for women to travel alone and go like the male apostles. And in the ancient world, there was a male authority in religious teaching and preaching that was not accepted among women. So the women apostles or disciples of Jesus still taught, but they had a little different role than the men, but it didn't mean that they were only disciples and not apostles. In the Johannine tradition, the apostles are ordained for the church on earth by a baptism of the Holy Spirit. Not just a baptism of water, but a baptism of fire. And in fact, in John's Gospel, there is no story of a Last Supper. As a matter of fact, Yeshua is crucified before the Passover supper, before the Passover meal. He's crucified as the lambs are being slaughtered for the Passover meal. And he doesn't have a Passover meal with his disciples, but he does have a meal. And in this meal, he washes their feet and shows that even he himself is a servant of all. And then he transmits to them by blowing on the crowns of their head the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, for them to do these works. And that is still preserved in the consecrating of a bishop, who is the successor of the apostles. The consecrating bishop breathes onto the crown of the head and performs this exsufflation to transmit the Holy Spirit to the next generation's bishop, and so on. So if we look at what apostolic tradition is, there were legendary first-generation apostles who were real people, James, Peter, Mary, John, Thomas, and so on. And each of them had their own unique personal experience with Yeshua, and they taught their own understandings in their own ways, and they went to different areas. They did not stay together all in one place like Jerusalem. They went out to other towns or returned to towns where they had come from and so on and brought the message there. But none of these left any historical writings, what we call autograph writings, unlike, for example, Muhammad, who wrote much of the Quran. These people did not leave us writings. If they had anything, they left us some notes. They left us disciples who transmitted their teachings and to whom they taught the teachings that they had gotten from the Master. And those disciples had disciples, etc. And those that were apostles laid hands upon others and gave them the right of succession of their apostolate and so on. And therefore, from each one of these apostles flowed a tradition, and it was different. It was separate. The tradition of Peter was different than that of Thomas. Thomas was ascetic. Peter was married. The tradition of Bartholomew was different than that of Philip, and so on. And the tradition of Mary Magdalene was different than that of other people as well. She left no historical writings, as none of the others left any writings. They only left a teaching, and that was carried on by others. Now, the later Gospels and Epistles and Apocalypses that developed under their names, not necessarily those that are part of the New Testament. For example, the Apocalypse of James, and we have apocalypses of other disciples besides John, and we have Gospels of many disciples besides Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we have epistles written by many more people than Paul, and so on. And this literature, which survived under the names of these original apostles, probably developed from their original schools, the individual schools of teaching, their lineages of descent of one disciple to another disciple to another disciple through history. And so they represent in some way their apostolic lineages or traditions, although not in any way that we would consider to be historically accurate. But in terms of legend and in terms of some of the ideas expressed, they're very important. James, for example, the Epistle of James in the New Testament, which is attributed to the tradition of James, the brother of Jesus, who was a successor of Jesus in Jerusalem as the head of the Jerusalem church, and was considered to be the holiest man in all of Jerusalem and all of Israel by many people. That epistle was not written by James. It was written by someone who was a disciple or a disciple of a disciple of James. And Martin Luther didn't like it. He didn't like that one at all, because that's the epistle where he says where he says faith without works is dead. He's telling you that faith means fidelity, faithfulness. That's what the word means, and it implies works. And Martin Luther wanted to say no, faith was belief, and it was not dependent upon works. So the Catholics were the ones who said that you could make up for your sin by good works, and no, that's not true. It's just by faith, which means belief in certain kinds of ideas and so on. And so Martin Luther didn't like it. But in matter of fact, the Epistle of James, which he called the Epistle of Straw and wanted expunged from the New Testament, in fact is a very important document, very important teaching of the apostolic tradition of James, and of a person who is considered to be the successor of Yeshua. And we have records of apostolic traditions. And the earliest one that we have is that of Paul. And Paul, as I say, was trained as a rabbi by the great Gamaliel, who's a great, well-educated and trained rabbi, who then became an apostle through his experience, his vision, and so on. And then he was taught the traditions of Yeshua through other disciples. And he refers to those in his writings as the paradosis. That means that which is handed down, that which is handed over. It's the tradition. And he said, I handed over to you that which was handed down to me. And the word is from this word, paradosis, which means a handing down of something. And this is the earliest apostolic tradition we really have any written records for. The letters of Paul, the authentic letters, not the later letters, not the pseudo-Pauline epistles, which are also called letters of Paul in the New Testament, but the really authentic early ones, Galatians and Romans and parts of Corinthians and so on, written about AD 50 to 70, this sort of period of time. That preserves for us an apostolic tradition, what was passed on to him. And what Paul tells us is that at that time there were many, many, many women leaders, women apostles and women disciples and heads of churches. Now we must understand something. Paul's letters are the earliest Christian documents we have. They're earlier than the Gospels, earlier than the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, and certainly a generation earlier than Luke and Matthew, and 2 generations earlier than John. So this is very important. This is the earliest written traditions about what was going on in the earliest churches. And Paul tells us about the women leaders of the church, whom he respects and works with as co-workers. Now, Peter's apostolic tradition is written down. Probably the earliest representation of that is Mark's Gospel, because Mark was a disciple of Peter. And Mark's Gospel was used as a template and as a reference point for the writing of the other two Gospels, Luke and Matthew, which are, on all three of them, then are called the Synoptic Gospels, because they all take the same point of view. In fact, they all transmit the Petrine apostolic tradition, the traditions that are associated with Peter, who was a great leader. It was really Peter who brought Christianity to the Gentiles. It was Peter who did away with the dietary food laws and did away with circumcision. And Peter was a tremendous architect of early Gentile Christianity. Even though Paul is the one who gets the credit, it really ought to go to Peter, because Peter is the one who really transformed Christianity in what would become a world religion. But his school, Peter's school, his apostolic school, is represented in this period from about AD 70 to AD 90 that it becomes really established as the leading apostolic tradition. And Paul's tradition really gets kind of lost. Paul establishes a lot of things that are important and they're referred to, but the Petrine school, the Petrine apostolic tradition, is the one that really rules at that point. And part of that tradition is the marginalization of female leadership. By the time we get to the Synoptic Gospels, we're looking at a church that no longer accepts women as apostles. We're looking at a church that looks upon and lumps all the women disciples together under the name Mary and a few other names, and does not credit them with anything powerful and important as Peter, for example. Peter's the rock upon whom the church will be built. Peter's name, Cephas, means rock, stone, and so on. And then we get to an even later period, the period of the pastoral epistles. These are the pseudo-Pauline epistles. These are the letters that were supposedly written by Paul, but weren't. They were probably written by successors of Paul, like the letter to Timothy and so on, which says, I do not allow a woman to speak in church, and things like this. These are the anti-feminist literature. And here, female leadership is now being actively suppressed in the Gentile Christian churches. And why? Because in Gentile Hellenistic society, men ruled. Women did not. And so what had begun as a social revolution in the discipleship with Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, was now completely smoothed over and suppressed, and male leadership became the name of the game. And that meant that any role of really important female leaders in an earlier time would be marginalized. In the Johannine school, by the time we get John's Gospel, this is at the beginning of the 2nd century, we have a very interesting phenomenon. Because it's clear from earliest tradition that the Johannine school in Asia Minor, the Johannine tradition, and John the Great, the youngest of all the disciples, was really worked with and very much under the mentorship of Mary Magdalene. It was John the Apostle and Mary who went to Ephesus, traveled there 10 years after the church at Jerusalem had been established, and before and just a few years before the event that Yeshua had prophesied came true, that is, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And they went to Ephesus, and it was John and Mary who originally led the church there. And Mary Magdalene was old enough to be his mother. In fact, took the role of his mother, and he supported her, and she supported him. But she was a great apostle of Yeshua. And so, under the original leadership of Mary Magdalene, and Mary passed away. She died after just a few years in Ephesus. John became the one who carried forward what he had learned of the inner traditions from Mary, and he's the one who then interpreted all this and put it forth as not just a messianic kind of theology, but as a Christology, as a whole teaching about Jesus himself. And we find this adoration of the persona of Jesus in John's Gospel in a way that it's not in any of the other Gospels, and only in a way that might have been developed, I think, by a woman and by a mother, or by a beloved woman disciple. John is called the beloved disciple. We're going to look later at why there's a very good case to be made for this referring to Mary Magdalene. Now let's take a look at the epistles of Paul. Of the 40 spiritual teachers and co-workers mentioned by name by Paul in all of his authentic letters, 16 of them are women. 40% of the leaders of the earliest church, apostles and other church leaders, were women. Now this is in the first generation after the death and resurrection of Yeshua. Several of these women are called apostles. They're not called just disciples, but apostles. Now, Mary Magdalene is not mentioned, but at this time, she would not be in the circle that Paul was traveling through. The Gospel of John and Eastern Orthodox tradition place her with the Apostle John in Asia Minor. Now, in John's Gospel, which is the latest of them, the last of them, and written quite some time later than the others, we have a tradition where standing by the cross is Mary. Now, Mary who is not defined, and John. Now, understand that in the earlier traditions and all the stories we have of the crucifixion, there are no men by the cross. And that is because any male disciples who were near the cross would be identified by the Roman police, and they would be arrested. So only women could be there safely, because there were many women disciples of Jesus, and also young boys. And there was one young boy, John. He was his brother was James the elder, but this was John, the young boy. What was he, 14, 15 years old? He was very young. He could safely be there at the foot of the cross. And according to this story, Yeshua looked down from the cross, and he says to John, he says to Mary, he says, "Mother, behold thy son." And he says to John, "Son, behold thy mother." Now, this has been interpreted in Catholic theology as the Apostle John is being given the responsibility of supporting Mary, the mother of Jesus, because Jesus, the son, the only son of Mary, is now gone, and there's no one to support her, which would be a pretty good shot, except for a couple of things. Namely, Jesus had some other brothers who could support her, and other people in the family, and also because we find no mention of the mother of Jesus in the Acts of the Apostles, where John, James, and Peter are the main players in the Acts of the Apostles in the Jerusalem church. So the mother of Jesus is not really in Jerusalem after the resurrection. She's in Galilee. However, it is a tradition in Eastern Orthodox religion that John and Mary came together. John was the young boy. Mary took the part of his mother. And they traveled together to Asia Minor, and they established teaching there. Now, so many scholars will interpret that as a legend about Mary Magdalene being given charge over John, the youngest of all the disciples and the apostles. In fact, the legend tells us that they don't really get together and travel together until for another 10 years. So it's more likely that in retrospect, the Gospel of John is written by disciples of the Apostle John. The Apostle John is accompanied by Mary Magdalene to Ephesus and Asia Minor. She dies there after a few years because she's quite old. She's the age of Yeshua's mother. And she has a very strong effect on John because she has been more deeply initiated than any of the other apostles, and he believes her. He believes the stories that she tells. And and the great mysticism of Johannine Christianity and Johannite Christianity is really established at that point, and probably is a point of departure for the apostolic tradition of Mary of Magdalene. And so both the Gospel of John and Eastern Orthodox tradition place Mary with the Apostle John at the time that Paul is making all of his travels around many different places. So we don't see Mary Magdalene mentioned by name except in one place in John's Gospel, which I'll show you later, and that would be in Rome. Now, my all-time favorite professor of Christian studies, of New Testament, etc., is Helmut Kester of Harvard Divinity School, where I attended some of his classes. And he talks about the name list in the Epistle to the Romans, which is found in chapter 16. Now, Romans 16 is not part of the original epistle sent to the Roman Church. It names several dozen of Paul's co-leaders that we know were in Ephesus at that time. For example, Prisca and Aquila from Corinth went to Ephesus with Paul, and they were not in Rome. And it was the same with many others. So we know that these are people that were in Ephesus at the time that he writes this thing. And this is actually a separate letter. It's a letter of recommendation for another great woman, a woman Christian teacher, Phoebe. She is called the prostatus, or she's the president, or the archisynagogus, or the patron, or the leader of a church in Cenchrea. And Paul calls her, and he uses the Greek male form, a deacon. This is the term he uses for himself. He calls himself a deacon of God, a servant. The word means servant, a servant of God. And he uses it in the male gender. He refers to her as a deacon, not a deaconess. And it's very interesting. We're going to find that the early leaders, the women leaders in the earliest churches, somehow earned the title of maleness. And that's going to be an interesting thing we're going to look at a little more later. We do know, for example, in the end of the Gospel of Thomas, the very last Logion, Peter looks at Mary Magdalene, who is sitting with the other male disciples, and he says, well, she should not be among us because she's a woman, and women are not worthy to enter the pardes and to enter into the kingdom. And Yeshua says, but we shall make her male, and then she will become worthy like every one of you, and so on. Well, this concept of women being made male is a spiritual idea that was unfortunately embedded in the Pythagorean and other ideas. For example, at the time of Jesus, there was a sect by a fellow named Dositheus. And it is said that Dositheus had a certain number of male disciples, and then they added to that a half. I think it was 29 and a half, or 30 and a half, or something like that. He had 30 and a half disciples, because the half disciple was a woman, and she was considered to be half a disciple because she had half a soul, and so there were 30 and 1/2 souls with him. A woman was an incomplete soul. A man was a complete soul, and therefore divine. So in this idea, the idea of women as half-souled and not complete and not able to work with imperishable things, because women were associated with that which waxed and waned and was perishable, that women, however, in Yeshua's frame of reference, would be made male. They would be made masculine, and they would therefore become like the angels, both male and female, because the angels in heaven were both masculine and feminine. They were neither married nor given in marriage. They were whole. And so for a disciple to become that way, he had to become like an angel, and so the woman had to become like an angel. Anyway, and he tells a parable about a woman who's become like an angel. He's a woman who had 7 husbands, and she goes and she is part of the Kima, or the resurrection, and it's because she is no longer married, given in marriage, or anything else. She's become like the angels. She's become whole. So this is the concept of women disciples being made male, is another term for spiritually whole. And Paul calls this woman a deacon, not a deaconess. He calls her the male term for a servant. And we find this in some other literature. It's going to be very interesting. He sends greetings to Junia and Andronicus, whom he calls apostles. Now, Junia is a woman, and we have inscriptions that show that this is a woman's name, but many fundamentalist scholars previously argued, that is, anti-feminist scholars, argued that the name must have been Junius, which is a male name, because it was unthinkable that women would be called apostles. However, great philologists like Hans Lietzmann show that there was a male named Junianus, but that was never shortened to Junius. And we have evidence now that there's no question about what the name Junia is a woman's name, and so she's called an apostle. Now, I want to emphasize that Paul's historical attitude towards his women co-workers in the churches was totally collegial. Paul has been made into quite a monster by a lot of feminists and so on, but actually Paul is their best friend. If they really knew and understood the writings of Paul, not the kind of Paul that's been portrayed or has been translated very badly in patriarchal churches, but the real, true historical Paul, they would find something quite different. In his earliest letter, that to the Galatians, he admonishes that there is no distinction of male and female in Christ. He makes a very big issue out of this. This is something that would be absolutely anathema to a rabbi, and he had been trained as a rabbi. But he's taken the same radical position as Yeshua, that men and women are equal souls. It's only in the late pseudo-Pauline epistles, like the Epistle to Timothy, do we find attitudes like, I do not allow a woman to speak in church, and so on. And this is a post-Pauline development in a male-dominated Gentile Hellenistic churches. So he got a bad rap on women and slavery and all kinds of things because of anti-feministic misinterpretations of his mystical allegories. He used Hellenistic institutions, for example, the institution of marriage and slavery, as allegories to illustrate points that he made, just as Jesus did, not as examples of how people should behave. For example, he tells, as any good mystic knows, that heaven is male to the worshipper or to the humanity, which is female. Christ is male, he's the bridegroom, and the church is female. It's the bride. Whether you're a boy or a girl, you're a bride of Christ. And that is a relationship between the human and the divine. And he talks about the marriage of Christ and his church. And out of that allegory, in which he is using simply Hellenistic marriage as an allegory to explain a spiritual reality, fundamentalists and other literalists go back and try to make it say that Paul is an advocate for Hellenistic marriage, which supported the subordination of women to men. And when in fact Paul in his epistles says that a man and woman should each be subordinate to each other in their relationship. But Paul has been trotted out as an example of subordination of women to men and so on. In fact, even in the classic marriage ceremonies, this particular allegory is quoted, that as the marriage betwixt Christ and his church is like that between a man and a woman. And that's baloney. Paul was not advocating that kind of relationship between men and women, and you can find places in the epistles where he very clearly advocates a very different kind of relationship. But it's been used and misinterpreted. And so Paul has gotten a bad rap. And someday when somebody does good, proper translations of the very difficult mystical language of Paul, we will see that no, Paul is not the anti-feminist, and no, Paul is not the person who is in favor of the subordination of women and all this. This was the later Gentile Christian churches that produced the New Testament. Here's a few more women apostles in the Pauline epistles that we learn about. And it's only from Paul we can learn about these women, because the later church will basically rub them out of history. They don't want them to be remembered. Mary and Persis are commended for their hard work in Romans 16:6 and 12. Euodia and Syntyche are called his fellow workers, and that term, fellow worker, is an equivalent term in Paul for apostle in the gospel. His fellow workers in the gospel. You find it in Philippians 4:2 and so on. He tells of women who were the leaders of house churches, such as Apphia and Prissa. And this practice is confirmed by other texts that also mention women who headed churches in their homes, such as Lydia of Thyatira, which we do find mentioned in Acts, and Nympha of Laodicea, and so on. These are women who would be archisynagogai. They would be the heads of the synagogues. They would be like the ministers of their churches. They would oversee the Eucharist and so on. They held offices. They played significant roles in group worship. Paul, for example, greets a deacon named Phoebe, we mentioned before, and then he sends her a letter of recommendation and assumes that women are praying and prophesying during worship in 1 Corinthians 11 and so on. As prophets, women's roles would have included not only ecstatic public speech, but preaching, teaching, leading prayer, and performing the Eucharist. Because if you look at the Didache, which comes at the very end of the 1st century, it assumes that the duty of leading the Eucharist regularly fell to the Christian prophets, and that would have fallen to Christian prophetesses as well. So I myself, as a bishop, have been ordaining women and consecrating women as bishops in the apostolic succession for 32, 35 years now, since I was made a bishop in the very late 70s. And I'm a strong advocate, and always have been, of women's ordination and of that full participation of women in apostolic succession and so on, and will always remain such. And that evidence is in the New Testament, and Paul would support me. Paul is my main support for this and my main evidence for this. So you women that are think that Paul is a big anti-feminist better have another think coming. He's going to eventually prove to be your biggest support. In Acts 17:4, he speaks of the chief women in Thessalonica who led their home churches. The chief women would have again been the archisynagogai. They would have been the head of the churches. So, how does the exclusion of female apostolic lines begin to occur? If we look at the earliest sources, and actually earlier than Paul, we have the traditions in the Gospel of Thomas, which go from about AD 40 to 60 of the Christian era. Here we find the little thing about Mary, the apostle, opposed by Peter because he said that women are not worthy of the divine life and all this sort of thing. And Yeshua says, oh, but look, we shall make her male, and we shall make her worthy, and then she will become worthy like you males, and all this sort of thing. Well, this, of course, is a document that we only have from 150 years later, but the tradition goes back very early. And so the controversy about women in having positions of any authority in discipleship was going on at the time of Yeshua. And some of his strongest male apostles, like Peter, who was a very powerful leader, very powerful person, was not all too hot about this idea of women at the very beginning. And the Peter versus Mary Magdalene theme recurs for a couple of hundred years in later Christian writings. So we know it existed. We know that Peter was not a big fan of Mary Magdalene. And we know that Mary also was a great, great apostle of Yeshua. Now the Pauline epistles, if you look at the same period, make it very clear that women are at this point considered to be equal to men, and there are many, many, many women leaders in the church. As I said, 40% of the names he mentions are women apostles and women leaders. By the time we get to the Petrine tradition that we find in Mark, about AD 50 or 60 of the Christian era, now we have Mary Magdalene is credited as being the first witness of the resurrected Christ. And Mark is the source for the accounts in Luke and Matthew. But she is not mentioned in her role as an apostle in the book of the Acts, which Luke writes. Luke writes, I mean, the author of Luke's gospel, because you see, Luke acts as one long epistle. It starts out, Dear Theophilus, blah, 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 and then the book of the Acts continues, Dear Theophilus, I told you before about so-and-so. It's a long, long epistle. And in the Lucan writings, even though they give us a lot of information supposedly about the mother of Jesus and things like that that are mostly legendary, in the book of the Acts, no mention is made at all of Mary Magdalene and her work, and we know she was very active. So after this period, we get a marginalization of Mary and other women leaders. As I mentioned in Luke Acts, which is a long epistle, the only mention of Mary is the credit they have to give her for being the person who discovers the resurrection. And after that, she's out of the picture. The only other thing that's said is she had 7 demons cast out of her by Jesus. And that is an implication, is that she was a great sinner. Now, that idea of Mary Magdalene as a great sinner is nothing that has come up before. It's now in this 3rd generation that all of a sudden we're trying to suppress the women's authority thing here a little bit. And she's never called an apostle. She's always called just a disciple. And then we get into the pseudo-Pauline epistles in the next generation. We find only male leadership in the churches, and this phrase is like, I do not allow a woman to speak in church, and so on. And then by the next centuries, church customs and laws are established against women teachers and leaders, and women are not ordained in apostolic succession. Women are not allowed to be leaders. They're allowed only to be virgins or widows, the minor orders in the church. And in the Marcionite Gnostic churches of the 2nd century, they developed some women leaders, but only as virgins of the church. In the 3rd century, so the 3rd century being the AD 200s, the advent of the Montanist movement, which is a very important movement of spirituality that a lot of very great of the great early church fathers were swept up into, like Tertullian and so on, was a kind of apocalyptic movement within Christianity that was very ascetic. And asceticism was sweeping things. The idea of sexuality is bad, and pleasure is bad, and if it feels bad, it's good, and if it feels good, it's bad, and this sort of thing. These ideas have become sweeping into Christianity through Hellenistic ideas. Yeshua was not at all an ascetic. In fact, he was criticized for being a libertine. And there was this movement led by women, a couple of women leaders who were prophets in Asia Minor. It was in the movement known as Montanism, and it was later declared as a heresy. But that's about the last time that we're going to find women leaders in Christianity until we get to Europe and the time of the Bogomiles and some of the other groups that are considered to be heretical and are in fact actually wiped out genocidally by Catholic-sponsored armies, papal-sponsored armies. And that's about the last time we're going to see serious women's leadership, until that kind of stuff, or Joan of Arc or something like this. This is the end of Module 1. The next module, in the next module, we're going to look at the legendary and probable historic life of Mary Magdalene.